The rain against the leaded glass of Oakhaven sounded like gravel hitting a coffin lid. I stood by the mahogany sideboard, my white-gloved hand as steady as a dead man's as I poured a glass of port. My pulse was exactly 60 beats per minute. It had been since I was 12 years old, the day my father taught me that a Thorne is a master of his nerves, or he is nothing. My breathing was shallow, rhythmic, and entirely controlled. I was the masterpiece of Oakhaven, a man of marble in a world of flesh. But at 11:14 p.m., the marble cracked. The heavy oak doors of my study didn't just open, they were heaved aside with a violence that shook the floorboards. I did not flinch, though the intruder looked like a phantom birth from the silt of the Thames. She was drenched, her tattered lace clinging to a frame that shivered with exhaustion, not fey. "You are trespassing, madam," I said, my voice as cold and precise as a winter frost. "The constabulary is exactly 4 minutes from my gate. I suggest you find your breath elsewhere." She didn't move. She didn't beg. She simply stepped forward, leaving a trail of black mud on my Persian rug, and dropped a blood-stained ledger onto my desk. I didn't look at her face. I looked at the book. My breath, the one thing I had mastered for 26 years, hitched. It was the black ledger, the one document in existence that could hang my father and erase the Thorne name from history. For the first time in my life, my hand trembled. The glass of port clattered against the sideboard. The discipline was dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. I looked up from the stained pages to the woman who had brought my ruin to my doorstep. Zipporah Penhaligon. I recognized the name immediately. Her father had been a merchant my father destroyed in a ruthless trade war years ago. She wasn't a victim seeking charity. She was a predator who had found the one weapon that could pierce my armor. "My brother, Balthazar, is scheduled for the gallows at dawn," she said. Her voice was thin but possessed a jagged edge that cut through the room's stillness. "He was framed for the theft of your family's silver, a crime orchestrated by your own kin to silence him." I felt the familiar urge to suppress the rising panic in my chest, to return to the icy logic of my upbringing. "You expect me to subvert the Queen's law for a common thief?" I asked, though my voice lacked its usual steel. "I expect you to choose between your dignity and your father's neck," she countered, her eyes flashing with a fire that no tutor had ever warned me about. "If Balthazar swings, this ledger goes to the High Sheriff. If he lives, the ledger stays in your hands." I looked into her eyes and saw a desperate, burning courage. My education had taught me to calculate risks, but it had never prepared me for a woman who would bang the world down to save her blood. I made a choice that I knew would haunt every hour of my remaining life. I would hide her in plain sight. "You will stay here," I whispered, "and we will play a dangerous game." By the time the sun struggled to rise through the Oakhaven mist, Zipporah was no longer a fugitive. I had her moved to the servants' wing, scrubbed to the river silt, and dressed in the stiff, high-collared wool of a governess. I introduced her to the household as Miss Penhaligon, a distant relative of a fallen associate. My servants, trained in the same silence I practiced, nodded without question. But Oakhaven had eyes that never closed. My uncle, Septimus Vane, arrived for breakfast with the predatory grace of a man who smelled blood in the water. Septimus had been the shadow behind my father's throne, a man who believed that any emotion was a terminal weakness. He watched Zipporah as she stood by the sideboard, her posture too straight, her hands too scarred for a woman of letters. "A new addition to the staff, Marmaduke?" Septimus asked, his voice a sibilant purr. He walked a slow circle around her, his cane clicking rhythmically on the stone floor. "She has the hands of a labor, my boy. Why does a Thorne keep such coarse company? Surely there were more refined candidates in London." I didn't blink. I forced my heart rate back down, even as I felt the heat of Zipporah's presence across the room. I was back in my mask, the porcelain facade of the Ice Master. "She possesses a rare intelligence, uncle," I replied smoothly. "Something this house has lacked of late." Septimus smiled, but his eyes remained cold. The mask was back on, but for the first time, it felt like it was beginning to itch. The first true test of my crumbling resolve came 3 nights later at dinner. Septimus was in a foul mood, his suspicions about Zipporah simmering beneath his polite exterior. To test me, to see if the iron he had helped forge in me was softening, he sought a victim. A young footman, barely 18, tripped while serving the turtle soup. A few drops splashed onto the lace of Septimus's cuff. The room went deathly silent. Septimus wiped the spot slowly, his face a mask of simulated regret. "Discipline is the spine of this house, Marmaduke," he said, turning to me. "A spine that has grown dangerously supple. Correct this boy. 10 lashes in the courtyard. Now." I looked at the footman, whose face had gone the color of ash. Then, I made the mistake of looking at Zipporah. She was standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the moonlight. She didn't say a word, she didn't plead, but her gaze was a scorching challenge. She was waiting to see if I was a man or merely a machine built by cruel architects. My father's voice echoed in my head, "Pity is a poison." But my heart, long dormant, thudded with a new, rebellious rhythm. I set my silver spoon down with a sharp clink that echoed like a gunshot. "There will be no blood spilled at this table tonight, Uncle," I said, my voice resonating with a power I hadn't known I possessed. "Or any night. The boy will be docked a day's pay. Nothing more." The servants gasped in unison. Septimus's eyes narrowed into slits of pure malice. The ice master had melted, and the water was beginning to boil. Late that night, unable to sleep, I sought the sanctuary of the library. I found Zipporah there, illuminated by a single guttering candle. She wasn't cleaning or organizing. She was tracing the spines of the forbidden books in the restricted section, volumes on philosophy and law that my father had deemed unsettling to the order. "You live in a cage of your own making, Mr. Thorne," she said without turning around. Her voice was a soft caress in the dark. "It is a fortress, not a cage," I replied, stepping into the circle of candlelight. "A fortress protects what is inside." "And what is inside?" she asked, finally turning to face me. "A man who saves footmen from lashes but cannot save himself from a dead man's ghost." The air between us suddenly felt thin. I reached past her to grab a map from a high shelf, my chest coming within inches of her shoulder. The proximity was a physical blow to my senses. The scent of her, rainwater, and something fiercely alive overpowered the smell of old parchment. My hand hovered over the wood. Instead of pulling the map, I pressed a hidden catch. A section of the shelving swung inward, revealing a secret compartment filled with ledgers and maps of the estate's underground passages. "I am not the only one hiding things, Zipporah," I whispered, sharing the very security I was sworn to guard. "My father didn't just build Oakhaven. He built a labyrinth to hide his sins. And I am the only one with the key." The following evening, a thick, yellow fog rolled off the moors, swallowing Oakhaven whole. I was walking the perimeter with my hunting rifle, a habit born of a restless mind, when a shadow darted across the rose garden. It was too heavy for a fox, too desperate for a poacher. I raised the rifle, my finger resting on the trigger with the cold mechanical precision I had been taught. "Stand and identify yourself," I commanded. The figure stumbled and fell near the stone fountain. Before I could approach, Zipporah sprinted from the servants' entrance, throwing herself between my barrel and the intruder. She shielded the man with her own body, her arms wrapped around his shivering frame. "Don't," she shrieked. I lowered the weapon, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the pale moonlight, I saw him. It was Balthazar. He was gaunt, his clothes in rags, and a jagged, festering wound ran down his forearm. He had escaped the transport to the gallows, but he was a dying man. "If he is found here, Zipporah, we all hang," I hissed, scanning the darkened windows of the manor for Septimus's silhouette. "The law is absolute." "Then help me hide him," she pleaded, her eyes wet with tears that shattered my last defenses. "Unless your discipline forbids mercy, unless you are truly nothing more than your father's shadow." I looked at her, then at the broken man at her feet. For the first time, I didn't care about the law. I cared only about the light in her eyes. "Take him to the cellar under the west wing," I whispered. "I will bring the medicine." The tension in the house was a physical weight. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an accusation. 2 days later, the peace was shattered by the arrival of Lady Tryphena, the town's most vicious gossip, and a woman whose tongue had ended more reputations than the plague. She arrived unannounced, her carriage emblazoned with a crest that demanded entry. "I hear you have a new governess, Marmaduke," she said, her eyes darting around the parlor like a hawk. A Miss Penhaligon? A curious choice. I don't recall the Penhaligons having any surviving kin in the teaching profession. Septimus sat across from her, a thin, knowing smile on his face. He was enjoying my discomfort. Zipporah was called to serve tea, a role she had to perform with the grace of a highborn lady to avoid suspicion. I watched in silent terror as she approached the table. She was stiff, her movements forced. As she reached for the teapot, her sleeve shifted, nearly revealing the scar on her wrist from the night she had scrambled over the estate walls. Lady Tryphena leaned forward, her spectacles glinting. "Is that a mark on your arm, girl?" My mind raced. Before the gossip could finish a sentence, I accidentally leaned forward and swept my hand across the table, sending my own porcelain cup crashing to the floor and drenching Lady Tryphena's silk skirts in hot tea. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" I exclaimed, feigning a shock I didn't feel. "My apologies, my lady. I seemed to have lost my footing." The distraction worked. The lady shrieked about her dress, and Zipporah vanished into the kitchen. I had saved her, but Septimus's gaze remained fixed on me, cold and calculating. To maintain the facade of a normal Victorian household and quell the rumors Lady Tryphena was surely spreading, I was forced to host a small, musical evening. It was a nightmare of propriety. The local gentry filled the ballroom, their whispers louder than the violins. I had ordered Zipporah to stay in the shadows, but Septimus had other plans. He insisted that the governess demonstrate her supposed skills by partnering with me for a waltz when a guest's daughter fell ill. It was a trap, a way to see how we moved together, to look for the sparks he suspected were flying. As the music swelled, I took her hand. It was the first time I had touched her in the light. Her palm was warm, her grip firm. As we moved across the floor, the world outside our circle vanished. The heavy scent of lilies and candle wax faded, replaced by the electricity of our proximity. "You are ruining me," I whispered, my lips inches from her ear as we spun. My heart rate was no longer 60, it was a drumbeat of war. "No," she replied, her voice a low vibration that traveled through my chest. "I am waking you up, Marmaduke. Feel your heart. It's not a stone. It's a riot." For a moment, the discipline vanished entirely. I pulled her a fraction closer than was proper, my hand pressing into the small of her back. The room blurred. I nearly confessed everything right there. My fear, my longing, my hatred for the life I led. But the music stopped, and the cold reality of Septimus's stare brought the winter back into my bones. Septimus was no longer content with mere suspicion. He knew I was changing, and he knew Zipporah was the catalyst. 3 nights after the waltz, he invited me to his private study for a reconciliation drink. He poured 2 glasses of the 1812 port, his movements fluid and fatherly. "You've been strained, nephew," he said, handing me the glass. "Drink. It will steady your nerves." I took a long swallow, trusting the blood tie that I should have feared. Within minutes, the room began to tilt. The portraits on the walls seemed to sneer, and the fire in the hearth turned a sickly, neon green. It was a hallucinogenic poison, a truth draught used by the secret societies my father had frequented. I tried to stand, but my legs were water. I stumbled out of the study and collapsed in the hallway, where Zipporah found me. She hauled me into a small linen closet, her face a mask of panic. In my delirium, the fortress walls in my mind crumbled. "He used to lock me in the dark," I wheezed, my voice cracking with a pain I hadn't felt in a decade. "The cellar, under the roots of the oak. He said if I cried, I wasn't a thorn. He burned the feelings out of me, Zipporah. He burned them all." Zipporah held me, her tears falling onto my burning skin. She wept for the boy I used to be, the boy who had been tortured into a statue. In that dark closet, the ice master died, and a broken, bleeding man took his place. The poison left me weak, but my mind had never been clearer. The following night, as I recovered my strength, I took Zipporah to the West Wing. This was the part of the house I had avoided since my father's funeral. The air here was stagnant, smelling of dust and forgotten sins. "There's a room here that hasn't been opened in 20 years, I told her, my voice rasping. I used a heavy iron key to throw back the bolt of my father's private sanctum. Inside, everything was as he had left it. On the desk sat his personal diary, bound in black leather. Zipporah and I pored over the final entries. We expected to find records of his business conquests. Instead, we found the anatomy of a murder. The entries described a slow, agonizing illness, the same symptoms I had felt from Septimus's port, but in smaller, lethal doses. My father had realized too late that his own brother was killing him to seize control of the Thorne interests. He didn't die of a broken heart or a failing constitution, Zipporah whispered, her eyes wide with horror. He was executed in his own home. The twist was a double-edged sword. My father was a tyrant, yes, but he had been a tyrant betrayed by a greater evil. I looked at the diary, then at the blood-stained ledger Zipporah still held. We now had the proof we needed to destroy Septimus, but we were trapped in his house, surrounded by his loyalists. Septimus was tired of waiting for the poison of doubt to work. He struck with the subtlety of a viper. While I was in the West Wing, he had his men ransack Zipporah's room. They found the blood-stained ledger she had hidden beneath a floorboard, the ledger that implicated my father in treason and Septimus in murder. The next morning, I was summoned to the dining room. Septimus sat at the head of the table, the ledger resting beside his plate like a trophy. Zipporah stood in the corner, her hands bound behind her back by two burly grooms. "A fascinating read, Marmaduke," Septimus said, tapping the ledger. "It seems our family has a history of colorful extracurriculars." "Let her go, Septimus," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I will do better than that," he countered. "I will give you a choice. The heiress Ursula Bramble is arriving this afternoon. She is wealthy, she is influential, and she is, as you know, utterly devoid of mercy. You will marry her. You will merge the Thorne and Bramble estates, creating an empire I will oversee. And if I refuse, then Miss Penhaligon is turned over to the High Sheriff with this ledger as proof that she murdered her father and stole these documents to blackmail us. She will hang by sunset, and her brother with her." The noose was tightening. I looked at Zipporah. Her face was pale, but her eyes pleaded with me not to give in. I realized then that I would do anything to keep her breathing. To save Zipporah's life, I did the one thing that felt like a death sentence to my soul. I agreed to the engagement. 2 hours later, Ursula Bramble's carriage arrived. She was a woman of sharp angles and even sharper words, a creature of pure ambition who saw marriage as a hostile takeover. Septimus gathered the entire household in the grand hall. I stood on the dais, my face a mask of iron once more. I felt Zipporah's gaze from the back of the room, a gaze that was now filled with a shattering sense of betrayal. She didn't know the terms of the bargain. She only saw the man she had awakened falling back into the cold patterns of his class. "It is my duty to announce," I began, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, "that Oakhaven will soon join with the Bramble estate. I have asked for the hand of Miss Ursula Bramble, and she has graciously accepted." The room erupted in polite applause. Ursula took my arm, her touch cold and possessive. I looked past her, searching for Zipporah. She looked as though I had struck her. She didn't see the silent vow in my eyes. "I will marry her to keep you alive, but I will never look at her. My soul belongs to the governess in the shadows." Zipporah turned and ran from the hall, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces of ice. The storm that had been brewing for weeks finally broke over Oakhaven with a biblical fury. Believing she was merely a pawn in a game of aristocrats, Zipporah chose the mercy of the sea over the cruelty of the Thornes. A kitchen maid informed me that Miss Penhaligon had been seen running toward the Black Rock Cliffs, a jagged precipice where the Atlantic tore at the shore. I didn't think. I didn't calculate. I threw off my frock coat, grabbed the reins of my fastest stallion, and rode into the teeth of the gale. The wind tried to unseat me, and the rain blinded my eyes, but I rode with a desperation that bypassed every lesson of my youth. I found her at the very edge of the abyss, her white dress fluttering like a broken wing against the black sky. She was inches from the drop, her eyes fixed on the churning foam below. "Zipporah!" I bellowed over the roar of the waves. "Go back to your heiress, Marmaduke," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Go back to your marble halls and your bloodless life. I am doing this for you." I shouted, dismounting and lunging toward her. "The marriage is a shield. Septimus would have hung you. I would rather die than see you sold to that woman," she cried, stepping closer to the edge. I would rather be a ghost than a secret. The storm peaked at that exact second. A bolt of lightning split a nearby pine, and in the strobe light flash of the world, I lunged. I caught her around the waist just as her heel slipped on the wet moss. We tumbled back onto the sodden earth, the roar of the ocean just feet away. The restraint of 26 years didn't just crack, it vanished into the wind. I held her against me, my hands shaking with a terror that no discipline could mask. I was sobbing, me, the ice master of Oakhaven, raw, ugly heaves of breath that tore at my lungs. You fool, I gasped, pulling her face to mine. You beautiful, stubborn fool. Do you think I care about the estate? Do you think I care about the Thorne name? I didn't wait for an answer. I claimed her lips with a hunger that was half desperation and half devotion. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and rain and the end of the world. My screams of frustration and love were lost in the thunder, but she heard them. For the first time, our souls were laid bare. There were no governesses, no masters, no heiresses. There was only the fire between two people who had found each other in the dark. I will not let them take you, I vowed against her skin. Not even the devil himself. We couldn't return to Oakhaven as we were. We found a small, derelict chapel in the woods, a place where the village poor went to pray in secret. The priest was a disgraced man, a drunkard with a kind heart who lived in the vestry. He saw the state of us, drenched, blooded, and desperate, and he didn't ask for a license or a fee. Under the cover of darkness, with the rain drumming a rhythmic benediction on the lead roof, we stood before a silent, candle-lit altar. My hands were still stained with the mud of the cliffs, and her dress was torn, but I had never seen anything more sacred. In the eyes of God, the priest mumbled, his voice thick with emotion, I pronounce you man and wife. We exchanged vows that weren't written in any prayer book. We promised to be the light in each other's cages, to be the truth in a world of lies. As I slipped a simple iron ring, a curtain tie I had fashioned into a circle, onto her finger, I knew the stakes had changed. We were husband and wife in the eyes of the heavens, even as the world prepared for my hollow wedding to Ursula Bramble. We were now a conspiracy of two, bound by a covenant that not even Septimus could break. Returning to the manor was like stepping back into a tomb. I had to become the statue again. I treated Zipporah with a freezing indifference that felt like a knife in my own gut. When we passed in the hallways, I looked through her. When she served the evening coffee, I didn't let our fingers touch. Septimus watched us like a vulture, searching for any lingering heat from the night of the storm. You seem to have recovered your senses, Marmaduke, he remarked, sipping his brandy. The girl looks properly cowed. She is a servant, uncle, I replied, my voice a flat monotone. Nothing more. But beneath the surface, Oakhaven was a pressure cooker. Every unspoken longing, every memory of the chapel, hummed in the air between us. Zipporah played her part with a chilling perfection, her face a mask of subservience that mirrored my own. But at night, I could hear her pacing in the room above mine, and I would press my hand against the ceiling, imagining I could feel the heat of her through the wood and plaster. We were living a lie to survive, but the lie was beginning to choke us both. The peace, if it could be called that, lasted only until the following Tuesday. Septimus's men, scouring the countryside for any sign of Balthazar's accomplices, finally tracked him to the hidden cellar. They dragged him out in chains, his wound now a deep, angry purple. To maintain my cover, to prove to Septimus and Ursula that I was still the ice master, I was forced to act as a presiding magistrate for the local district. The trial was a sham, held in the manor's own courtroom. I sat on the high bench, the black robes of my office feeling like a shroud. Septimus stood in the gallery, his arms crossed, a smack playing on his lips. Zipporah was forced to stand among the servants, her face a pale ghost in the shadows. I had to look at Balthazar, my brother-in-law, the man I had tried to save, and read the charges of grand larceny and prison break. The evidence is irrefutable, I said, the words falling like stones into a well. Under the laws of this land, the sentence for such crimes is death by hanging. I picked up the pen. My hand was steady, the old, cursed discipline returning at the worst possible moment. I signed the death warrant. I saw Zipporah's knees buckle. She didn't know I was already planning the escape. She only saw me as her brother's executioner. The day of the scheduled execution, the town square was packed. A grim festive atmosphere pervaded the air, the gallows standing like a skeletal finger against the gray sky. I stood on the raised platform, the high sheriff at my side. Zipporah was in the front row, held back by the crowd. I had to read the verdict one last time. I looked down at her, and for a second, the mask slipped. She looked at me with a hatred so pure it burned. She thought I had betrayed everything we had found at the cliffs and in the chapel. She didn't know that my eyes weren't fixed on her. They were scanning the perimeter of the square. I was looking for the 3 men I had hired with my own private inheritance, men who owed no loyalty to the Thornes or the Vanes. I was looking for the timing of the guard's rotation. Beneath my stoic exterior, I was a man possessed, calculating the exact second when the Ice Master would become a rebel. "Does the prisoner have any last words?" I asked, my voice echoing off the stone buildings. Balthazar looked at me, spat on the floor, and shook his head. The noose was placed around his neck. My heart was a riot, but my face remained a face of stone. The execution was stayed at the last second by a clerical error I had fabricated, giving us 48 hours of reprieve. But the pressure was mounting. Every night, while the manor slept, I didn't rest. I used my knowledge of the manor's ancient drainage system, the blueprints I had shown Zipporah in the library, to find a way into the local prison cells. The prison was built into the foundations of an old fort, and the Thorne estate sewers ran directly beneath it. I spent my nights in the filth, using a hand-pick to weaken the heavy stones beneath Balthazar's cell. I was exhausted, my lungs burning from the stagnant air, my perfect hands bleeding and scarred from a labor. I was no longer the master of Oakhaven. I was a mole in the dark, clawing for a life. I would return to my bed just before dawn, scrubbing the grime from my skin and donning a fresh silk shirt to meet Ursula for breakfast. The physical toll was immense, but the emotional toll was worse. I was a man divided, living 3 lives at once, and the seams were beginning to fray. The cracks finally became visible. At breakfast, Ursula Bramble reached across the table to touch my hand, a rare gesture of affection from a woman who usually kept a distance. I flinched, pulling my hand away too quickly. "Marmaduke," she said, her eyes narrowing. "Your hands." I tried to hide them, but it was too late. She grabbed my wrist, turning my palm upward. It was a ruin of blisters, deep cuts, and embedded grit. These were not the hands of a gentleman who spent his days in a study. These were the hands of a laborer. "What have you been doing?" she hissed. "If Septimus sees this." She knew. She didn't know the specifics, but she knew I was working against the family interest. She saw an opportunity to tighten her grip on me before the wedding. "I will tell him," she whispered. "Unless you prove your loyalty to me, and not to that girl." I had to humiliate myself. I dropped to one knee before her, the ultimate sign of submission. "Please," I whispered. "I will give you anything. My mother's emeralds, the deeds to the northern woods. Just stay silent for 3 more days." She smiled, a cold, predatory expression. I had bought her silence with my dignity, but the clock was ticking. The day of the wedding to Ursula Bramble arrived with a mocking sun. The village church was packed with the elite of 3 counties. Septimus stood in the front pew, looking like a king who had finally secured his empire. I stood at the altar, my hands gloved to hide the scars, my heart a hollow chamber of dread. The priest began the ceremony. "If any man can show just cause why these 2 may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." The silence that followed was agonizing. I waited for Zipporah to scream, for Balthazar to appear, for anything to break the spell. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church didn't just open, they were thrown wide. But it wasn't a lover or convict who entered. It was a squad of the Royal Constabulary, led by the High Sheriff himself. The congregation gasped, a wave of murmurs rippling through the pews. "Marmaduke Thorne," the sheriff shouted. I felt a surge of hope. This was the moment. The plan I had set in motion weeks ago, the letters I had sent to the Queen's investigators under the cover of night, had finally borne fruit. The Ice Master had finally played his final card. The sheriff didn't move toward me. He moved toward the front pew. He laid a heavy hand on Septimus Vane's shoulder. Septimus Vane, you are under arrest for treason against the crown and the murder of your brother, Silas Thorne, the sheriff declared. The church erupted into chaos. Septimus tried to stand, his face contorting into a mask of fury. This is an outrage. On what evidence? I stepped down from the altar, ignoring Ursula's shriek of indignation. I reached into my coat and produced the black ledger and my father's diary. The evidence is here, Uncle, I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the room. In your own hand and the hand of the man you murdered. I sent the transcripts to London 3 days ago. Your empire is built on blood, and today, the bill comes due. Septimus looked at me with a hatred that would have withered a lesser man. But I was no longer a man of marble. I was a man of fire. He was dragged from the pews, his screams of traitor, echoing off the stained glass. The reckoning had begun. But the villain was not so easily caged. In the confusion of the arrest, as the constables struggled to contain the outraged guests, Septimus managed to draw a concealed pocket pistol. He didn't aim for the sheriff. He aimed for the one person who gave me strength. He lunged toward the shadows of the vestibule where Zipporah had been watching. Before anyone could react, he had his arm around her throat, the barrel of the pistol pressed against her temple. Back, he screamed, his eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. If I can't have the Thorne legacy, Marmaduke, you won't have your heart. He backed out of the church door, dragging Zipporah with him.
A black carriage was waiting, driven by one of his last loyalists. They vanished into the fog, heading toward the derelict ironworks on the edge of the estate, the place where the Thorne fortune had first been forged in fire and shadow. Zipporah! I screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that tore from my throat. The discipline was gone. The fortress had fallen. There was only the hunt. I arrived at the ironworks as the sun was dipping below the horizon, turning the smoke-stained sky the color of a fresh bruise. The foundry was a skeletal ruin of rusted gears and towering chimneys. Inside, the heat was oppressive, the air thick with the smell of coal dust and old grease. I found them in the central casting hall. Septimus stood on a narrow iron catwalk, suspended over a massive vat of molten metal that glowed with a sickening orange light. He held Zipporah by her hair, her body dangling precariously over the heat. "Cry for her, Marmaduke!" Septimus shrieked, his voice bouncing off the corrugated iron walls. "Show me you're human. Show me the weak, snivelling boy I tried to burn out of you. Weep, and maybe I'll let her live." I stood on the floor below, looking up at the man who had destroyed my father and tried to do the same to me. My heart was screaming, every instinct screaming to rush him. But then, I felt it, the old discipline. Not the cold repression of my father, but a new, focused iron. A clarity born of love. "You want to see a Thorne, Uncle?" I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifying, calm whisper. "Then watch." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I began to climb the iron ladder toward the catwalk. As I moved, a burst of steam from a ruptured pipe scalded my shoulder, but I didn't flinch. A wall of flame from a secondary furnace licked at my coat, the heat blistering the skin on my face. I walked through the fire. I used the discipline to suppress the physical pain, to keep my footsteps rhythmic and steady. I was a man of marble walking through a furnace. Septimus's eyes widened. He had spent his life trying to make me a machine, and now he was facing the very monster he had created, but a monster fueled by a soul. "Stay back," he yelled, his hand trembling on the trigger. "I'll drop her. I swear it." "Then we will both fall," I said, stepping onto the catwalk. My eyes were locked on his, a cold, predatory stare that made the villain stumble back. He was terrified. For the first time, he realized that a man who feels everything but shows nothing is far more dangerous than a man who feels nothing at all. Just as Septimus tightened his grip on the trigger, a shadow dropped from the rafters above. It was Balthazar. He had used the tunnel I had weakened to escape the prison and had followed the carriage to the foundry. He swung down on a heavy hoisting chain, his boots slamming into Septimus's chest. The impact sent Septimus reeling back against the safety rail. Zipporah fell forward onto the catwalk, and I lunged, catching her and pulling her away from the edge of the molten vat. Balthazar didn't stop. He wrapped the heavy iron chain around Septimus's arms, pinning him to the rail. The villain was trapped, his pistol clattering into the orange depths below. "You're late," I gasped, holding Zipporah to my chest, my heart finally breaking into a frantic, joyful gallop. "The saws were a bit cramped, brother-in-law," Balthazar wheezed, his face covered in soot but his grin wide. We had him. The antagonist was neutralized, but the story wasn't over. The final movement of the Thorne legacy was yet to be played. With Septimus trapped and the constables finally arriving at the foundry gates, I stood over my uncle. I could have pushed him. I could have let the chain slip and watched him vanish into the fire. Part of me, the part that remembered the dark cellar, wanted to. But I didn't. I stood over him and spoke with the cold, devastating logic of a judge. I didn't scream. I simply recounted every sin, every murder, every lie. You killed my father because you were too small to lead, I said. You tried to kill Zipporah because you were too afraid of the truth. You are not a master of anything, Septimus. You are a ghost in a dying house. I forced him to look at me, to see the man I had become despite him. Under the weight of my gaze and the presence of the High Sheriff, who had followed us into the hall, Septimus finally broke. He confessed to everything, the poison, the treason, the frame-up of Balthazar. His words were recorded by the law, a final, pathetic admission of a life wasted on cruelty. Take him, I said, turning my back on him. I didn't need to see him hang. I had already won. The aftermath of the trial of Oakhaven was a scandal that rocked England. But I didn't stay to enjoy the gossip. I did the unthinkable for a man of my station. I liquidated the entire Thorne estate. I sold the manor, the lands, and the industrial holdings. I took the gold and did what my father never would have. I gave it back. I established a trust for the families Septimus had cheated. I paid for the education of the footmen I had saved. I dismantled the empire built on repression and blood, brick by brick. The Ice Master was dead. The newspapers called me a madman, a traitor to my class. But as I watched the Thorne sign being taken down from the gates of Oakhaven, I felt a lightness in my chest that no inheritance could buy. I was no longer a masterpiece of marble. I was a man with a clean conscience. Zipporah stood beside me, her hand in mine. We were no longer hiding. We were no longer governed. We were simply ourselves. We moved to a small, whitewashed cottage on the coast, far from the soot of Oakhaven and the judgment of London. It was a simple life, filled with the sound of the sea and the scent of gorse. One evening, as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Zipporah found me sitting by the hearth. In my lap was the only thing I had kept from the manor, my father's rules of conduct, the handwritten manual he had used to raise me. I flipped through the pages. Rule 1, never show pain. Rule 4, a thorn does not weep. Are you going to keep it? She asked softly. I looked at the book, then at the woman who had taught me the value of a single tear. I dropped the manual into the flames. We watched together as the pages curled and blackened, the words of the tyrant turning to ash. And then, for the first time in my 26 years, I let the fortress fall. I leaned into Zipporah's shoulder and I sobbed. I cried for the boy in the cellar, for the father I never knew, and for the man I had been forced to be. I was finally, truly free. Years later, a traveller passing through our village might have heard of a man named Marmaduke, a man known as the most empathetic soul in the county, a man who listened with his heart and spoke with a kindness that seemed almost otherworldly. I still had my discipline. But it was no longer a discipline of silence or stone. It was a discipline to never let a day go by without telling Zipporah she was my breath. It was a discipline to feel every joy, every sorrow, and every spark of the world around me. The man of marble had become a man of soul. As we walked together through the golden fields at sunset, our shadows long and entwined on the grass, I realized that the greatest mastery of all wasn't controlling one's emotions. It was having the courage to obey them. Loving her was the one discipline I could no longer obey, and in that failure, I had found my only true victory.